The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody to the Yaron Brook Show. Hope you're having a good day. See if we can fix our problems on Facebook and get the show rolling. Yeah, there we go. All right, Facebook looks like it's working. All right, welcome. What day is it today? Monday today. Hope everybody's having a good Monday. Maybe some of you are working, some of you might not be. I was working, but maybe some of you are not because of this whole coronavirus. And I have to tell you, I was really looking forward to doing some shows that are not about the coronavirus. I did a few last week. I did some interviews. I did some other stuff. I'm really sick of tired of talking about coronavirus. I really think I also have said everything I have to say about coronavirus. So I've told you what I think. I'm trying to get, because, I've told you what I think, which is, not that important in a field like, as it relates to the corona. But I've said all my opinions about this. I've told you what I think the solution needs to be from here on, and so on. So I've covered all that. And I was looking forward to doing a completely different show and actually not doing coronavirus until I had Dr. Amesh Adalja on the show, who actually has something, worthwhile to say and educated and knows a gazillion times more than me about the topic. So I thought we'd wait until then to do another show about coronavirus. And I'm trying to get him on the show. He's in principle agreed. It's just a question of his schedule. He is so busy. He does so many shows that it's hard to get him to a particular time and a particular day. So I'm still hoping this week to have Amesh on the show and to talk about coronavirus. But other than that, I'm trying not to do shows on it. But all weekend, I've been getting emails from people saying I have to watch this doctor, this video of this doctor talking about coronavirus. So Dr. Erickson, COVID-19 briefing, and I kept getting them all weekend. So I said, okay, I'll watch it. So I watched it. I got about 9 minutes into it, and I was like, this is ridiculous. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and really, I agree with most of his conclusions, but he can't do the numbers. He can't do the math. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So I stopped watching. I didn't watch the rest of it, and then I kept getting emails, and I tried to explain why I didn't think this guy was right, and why I think there were real problems here, and why he discredits kind of the anti-lockdown position because he bases it on bad math, bad statistics. And I think that's not a good idea. And it didn't help. People kept recommending this. I guess, I'm looking at it. It was this video, Dr. Erickson's COVID-19 briefing, was filmed on April 22nd, and it has 5 million views. 5 million views. So a lot of people are watching this stuff. So I looked at it again today, and I said, and somebody sent me an email, you got to see this. This is great. And I said, okay, I have to actually show people why this is wrong, right? And while it's true, Dr. Erickson is not a mathematician. He is a doctor, but he's basing everything he says on math, not on medicine, right? So, okay, if you're not a mathematician, and you don't have to be a mathematician. Any one of you could see the flaws in what he's done in a minute when I show you and explain to you. Well, maybe not every one of you, because many of you send me the video. So what I want to do is go over some of this, tell you where I agree with him, particularly early on, we'll agree, and then do a little bit of when he gets into the stats, show you why the stats are wrong, and then skip it. Because once he's wrong on that, it doesn't matter what he says afterwards. And again, I agree with the underlying assumption, which is the lockdowns are wrong. But if you don't get the math right, and if you base your conclusions on the math, then it doesn't help our cause, it hurts our cause. Now, here, it's not an issue of because the math is division. He's not getting the division wrong, although in one case he does, in a pretty significant way. He doesn't get the division wrong. He gets the inferences wrong. And that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to do that. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it, because, but since it's such a watched video, and since so many of you sent it to me, I feel like obligated. I sent a lot of people like emails and texts and saying, I don't think it's any good, but I didn't explain. So now we'll explain. And we'll start with the good stuff, because we're starting at 2 minutes and 20 seconds in. We said some things that are true, which I think are interesting and right. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna talk about that. Then we're gonna go. Then we're gonna go to the stats and see where I think he completely messes up. All right, here we go. So let's see. Let's make sure you guys. I think you guys will hear this. If you can't hear this, let me know.
Focusing on COVID. And so one of the things I'd like to talk about is when I talk to ER physicians around the country, what's happening? Well, because COVID has become the focus, people with heart disease, people with cancer, hypertension, and various things that are critical are choosing not to come in based on fear.
And I think this is true, and I think very dangerous, and I think one of the real costs of the lockdown and of the fear-mongering. Now, it's true that in New York, and we'll talk more about New York, it was probably good that they didn't come in, because New York hospitals, at least some of them, were so overrun that it was good that they stayed away. But in most hospitals in the United States, particularly where this doctor is, and Dr. Erickson, I should have introduced him, is a physician in a network of hospitals, private hospitals, clinics in California. In California, where the hospitals are not overloaded, indeed the hospitals are empty, where doctors are being furloughed, where nurses are being furloughed, this is a real problem. And a problem that should have been addressed early on. Early on.
So what that's doing is causing the health system to focus on COVID and not focus on a myriad of other things that are critical, because we don't have the staff there, and the major component is fear. People are saying, I don't want to go get seen by my doctor. What if I get the COVID? So there is a lot of secondary effects to COVID that are.
I think all of that is true. All of that is what we see, again, particularly in hospital systems that are not overloaded, where there's no problem, which is 90% of the country right now. But yes, I mean, hospitals should be functioning normally. There should be outpatient. There should be elective surgeries. There should all be, these things should be going on until you get this massive spike like we got in New York, if you ever get that, where you then have to stop those other processes. But that's not what's happening. And this is medicine driven by fear. Policy driven by fear, and policy and medicine dictated by politicians, not by physicians.
Talked about. And so we'd like to kind of look at how we responded as a nation and why we responded. Our first initial response 2 months ago was a little bit of fear. We decided to shut down travel to and from China. These are good ideas when you don't have any facts. We decided to keep people at home and isolate them. Even though everything we've studied about quarantine, typically you quarantine the sick.
This is interesting, right? Typically you quarantine the sick, and that's absolutely right. Quarantine, as in forced isolation, is usually applied to the sick, and that's what South Korea did. That's what Taiwan did. You test and you quarantine the sick. Again, the fundamental failure of the United States response to coronavirus was not testing on scale early on, and not quarantining and tracking and doing the things necessary. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on when I want to recommend an article to you about the whole corona thing.
When someone has measles, you quarantine them. We've never seen where we quarantine the healthy, where you take those without disease and without symptoms and lock them in your home. So some of these things, from what we've studied from immunology and microbiology, aren't really meshing with what we know as people of scientific minds that read this stuff every day. So that's kind of how we started. We don't know what's going on. We see this new virus. How should we respond? So we did that initially. And over the last couple months, we've gained a lot of data. Typically in Kern County, for instance,
And now from this point on, for the next, good 10 minutes of talking over that, it's all about the data. And this is where it goes completely wrong.
Tested 5,213 people, and we have 340 positive COVID cases. Well, that's 6.5% of the population, which would indicate...
It's not 6.5% of the population, and this is the key. Right? They tested 5,213 people. They had 340-something positive. Now, is that sample a random sample? No. That is people who came to the clinic because they had symptoms. They felt sick. They biased sample. And of those that were tested who came to the clinic with symptoms, 6.5% tested positive. That's not a population. That's a biased sample. A sample that you would think was preconditioned to have a high rate of positives because they were feeling something. They weren't feeling well. Indeed, at least until recently, the CDC said, don't test people without symptoms. We don't have enough tests. And California explicitly said, don't test people without symptoms. We don't have enough tests. So the people that are being tested are people who have symptoms. And therefore, you cannot talk about the population of people who have symptoms and who go to get tested, which is another condition. 6.5% of them, in his sample, tested positive.
It's a widespread viral infection, similar to flu.
Flu has far greater than 6.5%. So he's already injecting this flu stuff where there's no basis to do that. There's no statistical, based on his numbers, basis to do it yet.
We think it's kind of ubiquitous throughout California. We're going to go over those numbers a little bit to kind of help you see how widespread COVID is and see how we should be responding to it based on its prevalence throughout society, or it's the existence of the cases that we already know about.
But they don't know how many cases are throughout society. All they know is the cases among those who are tested. And you'll see again and again and again how this one fallacy, and it's a fallacy in statistics. You cannot take a non-random sample and then extrapolate to society. I mean, this is like statistics 101. And it's very difficult to construct a random sample that is indeed reflective of society. To make those extrapolations, no statistician, a statistician could construct such an experiment. And even when they do, it's very, very, very difficult. But this guy, this doctor, just throws out the numbers and then, well, this is the percentage in the population. Watch what he does with California.
So if we look at California, these numbers are from yesterday. We have 33,865 COVID cases out of a total of 280,900 total tested. That's 12% of Californians were positive for COVID.
Now note, every one of the 280,900 who went to get tested likely had a pre-existing condition. That had symptoms, not a pre-existing condition. They were a biased sample. They weren't a random sample where we tested randomly in the population, 280,000 people, and 33,000 tested positive. No, this is a biased sample. So what he's doing now, he's going to say, watch what he does with this.
So we don't, the initial, as you guys know, the initial models were woefully inaccurate. They predicted millions of cases of death, not of prevalence or incidence, but death. That is not materializing. What is materializing in the state of California is 12% positives. Well, if we have 39.5 million people. If we just take a basic calculation and extrapolate that out, that equates to about 4.7 million cases throughout the state of California.
You can't do that. You cannot do that. He just said of all of Californians. 12% of all of Californians have it. Now, it might turn out that they do, but not based on this. Not based on this, sorry. And it's sad because, again, I think the motivation to argue against lockdowns and everything is a good motivation, but this is amateur hour. And he later says things that I would never go to this guy as a doctor. I wouldn't. Based on just his attitude and based on how if you can't do this kind of, if you can't extrapolate here, I don't want to even think about what kind of treatment he provides me. I want to skip ahead a little bit to New York, because the fact is, however you look at the numbers in California, they're low. They're very, very low. And I'll give you a few more seconds of this, and then we'll skip to New York. California, they're very, very low. There's no justification in a dispersed place like California to have these kind of lockdowns. It is literally insane, in my view, to lock people down all over the California where the prevalence of this is so low, even if you don't buy his extrapolation. But that is not true in New York.
Which means this thing is widespread. That's the good news. We've seen 1,227 deaths in the state of California with a possible incidence or prevalence of 4.7 million.
So he divides the number of deaths by 4.7 million, but he has no basis for the 4.7 million. He just pulled that out of air. This is not true. This is just, I don't know if he's doing it on purpose or not, but this is so amateur that it is shocking, truly shocking. And the fact that 5 million people view this, and the fact that it gets so many positive ratings, and that people don't get this, is a little scary to me.
0.03 chance of dying from COVID-19 in the state of California.
That is called disinformation, misinformation. Misinformation.
0.03 chance of dying from COVID in the state of California. Does that necessitate sheltering in place?
Of course not, but neither
does
that double that or
necessitate
triple
shutting
that.
down medical systems?
That's not the point.
Does that necessitate people being out of work? So that's California, and that's. I also wanted to mention that 96% of people in California who get COVID recover.
What does that mean? 96% recover. If that were the case, 4% don't recover, 4% die. So even the way he's using language is just not being accurate. I think he says 96% recover without hospitalization. But 96% recover, so 4% die? That can't be right. You just said 0.03. So it's so sloppy.
Almost no significant sequelae or no significant continuing medical problems. So those are important statistics for the state of California. 2 months ago, we didn't know this.
So is it true that over 4% of the people who get COVID have significant ongoing problems? Because I'd like to know that. That's a big number. If you have a probability of 4% if you get COVID to have significant problems into the future, that's not the flu. The flu you get, you're over. But if this actually, that's what he's implying. It's not what he means to imply, but that's what he's implying. Again, you've got to listen to what people actually say and think about what it actually means.
Light now, because we're sharing our own data. This isn't data filtered.
But it's not his own data. The data he gave us was California data on 12%. That is filtered by the state of California. His own data was 5,213 versus 340 positives, which is only 6.5. So he used the number that is double his own data, and yet he keeps going back and saying, this is our own data. We don't have a dog in this fight. We're not politicians. This is real data. Bullshit.
Through someone. This is our own data. We found 6.5%, and then California has found 12%. So the more you test, the more positives you get. The
more you test, it's not true. The greater the number of positives you get, but the actual percentage actually goes down. Actually goes down the more you test. We'll get to in California, in New York in a minute. We'll get to that. I'll give you the numbers there. But he's just none of this is right.
Prevalence number goes up, and the death rate stays the same. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
That is true.
And as we move through this data, what I want you to see is millions of cases, small amount of death. Millions of cases, small amount of death. And you will see that in every state. And since we're talking about following the science, we're going to follow the statistics and follow the science. So I want to look at New York State.
Let's do New York.
They've been in the news a lot, right? And their numbers are critical. Let's go over their numbers. Cases of COVID as of yesterday, 256,272 cases in New York State. Not New York City, New York, the entire state. They did a total of 649,325 tests. That's 39% of New Yorkers.
So here's an example. That is 39% testing positive, right? Now, a few days have passed since he did this video, and the number of tests has increased in New York, and the rate of testing positive, even though the number of tests has grown, the rate of testing positive is actually shrunk. It's now 35%. And my guess is the more you test, the rate of testing positive is shrink because you're expanding the universe probably to beyond people with symptoms. So what he says earlier, where the more you test, the greater the percentage, it's just not true.
Tested positive for COVID-19. That's their ratios. This is public data online. You can all look it up.
Yep.
39% of people who were tested.
39% of the people were tested.
Now this guy is trying to correct him. He's trying to give him an out. And Dr. Erickson doesn't take the out because he's convinced he's right. Listen.
Right.
The New York State is there's 20 million people there would be close to 4 million.
Which is likely, they likely have 7.5 million cases in New York.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
Not 39% of every New Yorker. It's every New Yorker who's been tested.
Right. So we extrapolate data.
I just want to make
Listen
We
to
extrapolate data, we test people, and then we extrapolate for the entire community based on the numbers.
Oh my God. I mean, this guy would fail statistics class or a reasoning class, a critical reasoning class. He would fail. That is just not true. You can't do that extrapolation. You cannot do it. And all of us need to become much, much better critical thinkers. If we're going to stand up to these politicians and these experts and these idiots who are presenting us with data, who are convinced they can run our lives, we better be much better thinkers if we're going to challenge this. And this is not good thinking.
The initial models were so...
This does not include antibody tests. Antibody tests are completely different. And there's a whole problem with antibody tests, which is false positives are very high in antibody tests. But this is not including antibody tests. This is, and you can look the numbers up because you can look it up on websites that this is just positive, negative. Right now, do you have it? Not antibody.
You're right. They're not even...
But in those initial models, a lot of them were based off if we did no social distancing.
Right.
Is that correct? So is it really fair to say, obviously they're not as bad as they were because those were based on alternative...
I'm just going to skip forward a little bit.
And they have a 92% recovery rate if you are indeed...
Again, what is 92% of what? Let me just find the right spot here.
7.5 million cases? We don't know. We will never test the entire state. So we extrapolate out. We use the data we have because it's the most accurate we have versus a predictive model that have been nowhere in the ballpark of accurate.
You cannot do that.
So how many deaths do they have? 19,410 out of 19 million people, which is a 0.1% chance of dying from COVID in the state of New York.
By the way,
and they have
that is just not true. Okay? If you divide 20,000, which is 19,000 something, which is what he said, divided by 7.5 million, you get 0.267. I mean, 0.26, something like that, right? He just said that you get 0.1. No, I think he said 0.13. No, it's exact double that. It's 0.267. Now, you shouldn't be divided by 7.5 because 7.5 is out of nowhere. But you can't even do the math. That's a calculator. I just pulled out a calculator. I said, no, that doesn't look right. Let me divide 20 by 7.5, 20,000 by 7.5 million, and it comes out as 0.26%. Now, 0.2% is still low, but 0.2% is, according to Dr. Erickson, the mortality from the flu is 0.13. 0.26 is double mortality of the flu. Now, that's not hysteria, but it's double. It's not the flu. It's double the flu. Now, the number of New Yorkers who have this is not 7.5. The estimates that have been made based on antibody tests are that about between 3 to 4 million New Yorkers, and even that, we don't know exactly, right? But let's say 3 to 4 million New Yorkers, that's what the latest tests have shown, have it. And if that's the case and 20,000 have died, then 20,000 divided by 3 to 4 million is something around 0.5, 0.6%. Now it's 6 times more than the flu. Now, that's real. 6 times more than the flu is real. Paul asked why you can't do the extrapolation. I've said it. I guess you came in late. Because you can't extrapolate from a biased sample to a general population. Again, Stat 101. To extrapolate, the sample has to be a random sample or a sample that represents the population. But here we know the sample's not random. We know it doesn't represent the population because the only people that are being tested are people who have symptoms. And you expect that among people who have symptoms, the percentage of people who test positive is going to be significantly higher than among people who don't have symptoms. It's a biased sample. It's biased because of the symptoms. You can't extrapolate from a biased sample. It's I'll say this one more time for those of you who came in late. It's very, very difficult to construct a sample from which you can extrapolate to a general population. It's a science to do that. And it's the serological tests, the antibody test. That's what they're trying to do. And it's very difficult, so many of them are failing. What they're trying to do is find a sample out there of a few hundred people that they can test. And from that test, because the sample represents different ages and different, let's say, socioeconomic people in different geographies and different densities and different health statuses maybe, then you find several hundreds of those and you test them and you control statistically. Then you can extrapolate to a population. But that takes huge amounts of work to do that. You can't just assume that everybody you test because they come to you to be tested, particularly if the condition for testing is that you have a symptom. You can't assume that that is a sample. It's not. It's not representative, and you cannot extrapolate. And again, this is not science fiction. This is at most, one of two things: Stat 101 or Critical Thinking 101. Now, let me see. What more do I want to talk about here? I want to move it a little forward to when he talks about the flu, because I think there's some interesting stuff when he talks about the flu. Let's see if I can find it.
Flu. And we had a similar death rate. The deaths in the United States were 43,545, similar to the flu of 2017, 2018. We always have between.
By the way, we're really early in this coronavirus thing. There's over 50,000 dead, and we're early. I mean, we're beyond maybe the peak, but there might be other peaks, and some parts of the country have experienced it, some parts have not yet, and it's contagious, so it's probably going to spread. So we're only at 50-something thousand dead. Why are we assuming it's over? Why is that the number being used? As if it's done. I hope it's done. That would be great. Nobody died tomorrow. But this is likely to be over 60,000. That's an easy projection for me to make right now. Probably over 60,000 in the next week or so. It's likely to reach 80,000, which is what some doctors have been saying all along. And it could be much more than that if it comes back in the fall or if it doesn't go away in the summer. So why are we ready to take the numbers as they are right now and come to conclusions about this? Right? The only conclusions we come is, of the people sick right now, this is the number who are dying. But we don't know how many people are sick right now because we haven't run enough tests and we haven't done the kind of random samples that you would have to do in order to figure this out. Right? This is massive misinformation. Massive misinformation. In a cause I'm not unsympathetic to, which is opening up the economy, opening up our lives. But this discredits the opening up our lives attempt. Because if you do it with bad information and bad, thinking and bad extrapolation, then you're discrediting the cause. The cause is a cause of freedom. The cause is the cause of having a rational attitude towards this disease. But if you're trying to do that with irrationality, it should be obvious that can't work. 5 million people have watched this video. My rebuttal to this is going to get to a couple of thousand maybe. It's tragic that this is going to be what represents. All right, let me just do this flu again a little bit. Again, the number in New York, he did the math wrong. The number in New York is more than double the flu, and that's assuming his 7.5 million people have the virus in New York, which is a number he's plucked out of thin air. He's extrapolated out of thin air, all right? But there's something else he says.
7 and 60,000 deaths in the United States every single year. No pandemic talk, no shelter in place, no shutting down of businesses, no sending doctors home.
That's from the flu, by the way, just to clarify.
Yeah.
37,000 and 60,000 flu deaths
37
every year
60,000.
per the CDC.
Due to flu
Okay. In the United States. Some
number's
years,
right.
it's even as low as 20,000 some year. In 2017, 2018, it was 45 to 50,000, depending on who you read. And we don't necessarily report all of our flu tests. We do thousands of flu tests every year. We don't report every one because the flu is ubiquitous. And to that note, we have a flu vaccine. How many people even get the flu vaccine? The flu is dangerous. It kills people. So just because you have a vaccine doesn't mean it's going to be everywhere. And it doesn't mean everyone's going to take it, because we see every year that we have a vaccine, and I would say probably 50% of the public doesn't even want it.
Do you think it would be relevant, if you're talking about a flu vaccine, to talk about the fact that the flu vaccine is not necessarily vaccinating you against the particular strain of flu that occurs that year? That flu every year is a different strain, and when they put out the vaccine, they're in a sense guessing or estimating or making their best assumptions about which strain will hit the population at that point in time. So that even if you get the vaccine, you could get the flu because you might be vaccinated against the wrong flu, the wrong virus. That is crucial information. Because a corona vaccine will be a vaccine targeted at the one virus, and therefore will be far more effective than a flu vaccine. And even if not everybody gets it, the vaccine, there will be far fewer. Again, it's this kind of muddled thinking that would, turn me off of this doctor completely, right? All right, so. I don't want to keep going. He keeps going on this stuff. And again, some of the stuff he says later on is fine, but the stuff he says about Sweden, the stuff he says about Norway, none of it's right. None of it's right. He makes basic errors. He leaves information, critical information, out of the equation. And it's just a discredit to to what you're trying to do. Now, all right, so that's it. That's my thing on Dr. Erickson. I really think I would encourage you to link to this video, and what we'll do is we'll cut this section out, so there'll be a video just on my critique of Dr. Erickson, and share it with people who share that video with you, because we've got to combat this stuff. You've got to combat bad science. You've got to challenge bad science. You've got to challenge bad science. Because particularly if that bad science might be confused as advocating for the same cause we're advocating for. Very dangerous. Now, let me recommend a piece I read today. I haven't finished it. I'm like 3/4 of the way through, but it's really good. Not good because I agree with everything in it. I don't. But it's good because it tells an important story. It tells it in an interesting way. And I think you can learn a lot about this whole coronavirus from it. So it's a piece in the New Yorker magazine. New Yorker magazine is at newyorker.com. And the title of the piece is Seattle's leaders let scientists take the lead. New York's did not. And of course, the countries did not. The USA country. And it tells the different story about how coronavirus was dealt with by Washington State, particularly Seattle, and how it was dealt with by New York. And how Washington State basically let the scientists lead and figure out what to do and follow their lead. They did lockdown, but from the article, it strikes me that they didn't need to, because by the time they did a lockdown, well over 50% of people were already working from home. And it's not clear that they needed a lockdown, but that's my quibble with it, right? And it's not clear the experts recommended a lockdown, the medical physicians, but that's where the politicians get involved. But it tells you a lot about the experts, who they are, what makes them experts, how much training they have, their skill, not just in knowing what to do, but in knowing how to communicate with people. A lot of what they study about pandemics is how to communicate with people to try to encourage them to engage in the right behavior. Right? And for example, one of the things they did in Seattle was they wanted to let the public know this was serious. And so they communicated in an ever-growing way the seriousness of that. And then at some point, before lockdowns, before anything, one of the scientists called up Microsoft and said to the vice president of Microsoft, he said, "Look, this is a serious issue. There's a real issue here. Would you be willing to let your people know that if they can work home, they should work at home? They shouldn't come into work. And would you make that public?" And Microsoft agreed. So Microsoft announced that they were encouraging people to work at home, and they were voluntarily, but they were trying to get as many people to work at home as possible, and that this was because they were taken seriously. And soon after that, Amazon announced the same thing. And immediately, everybody, the regular people in the culture go, "Whoa, this must be serious if Microsoft is doing that. It must be serious if Amazon is doing that." And the scientists describe that that's part of their methodology to raise people's awareness and attention to the issue. So then when they tell them, you really should stay home as much as possible, they start taking it seriously. So Seattle did this quite effectively. Now, they also did a lockdown, but they did this quite effectively. And in spite of the fact that they had some of the worst outbreaks early on, they have controlled this and managed this really, really well. New York is the opposite. New York, from the beginning, let politicians run things and put barriers, regulatory, bureaucratic barriers in front of scientists, in front of testers, constantly. De Blasio was a disaster, Cuomo a disaster. And they both, one of the things that this article argues is that in a pandemic, you want to let the scientists communicate. They know what they're talking about. One of the problems in New York and one of the problems in Washington, D.C., is that the primary communicators about this have been politicians. And therefore the communications have been horrible, have been ineffective, have been confusing, have been misleading. So just that shift of, anytime you see a politician elbow everybody aside and take center stage with some the seal of the state or flag waving in the background, you're in trouble. This is a power-lusting politician using the limelight, using an emergency to take power. Never let a crisis go to waste. That's what Cuomo, Trump, de Blasio, all of them are like this. And to the credit of Washington State, the governor, for the most part, not completely, stayed out of it. Let the scientists do their thing. Let the scientists communicate. Let the scientists run the briefings. Why is Trump even at the briefings? What does he have to add? Nothing. Zilch. He doesn't know anything about this. I'm not blaming him for it. He's not a doctor. He pretends to be one. He gives medical advice constantly at the briefings. But he's not a doctor. So why is he even there? Why isn't it just the people who actually know what they're talking about? Now, if you wanted an expert on political philosophy up there, that would be one thing. But what do you need the President of the United States there for? He doesn't need to be at the public briefings. It should be just experts. So I highly recommend this article, New Yorker magazine, newyorker.com. It's called Seattle's Leaders Let Scientists Take the Lead. New York's did not. And very well written and very interesting, thought-provoking. And again, I don't agree with everything in the article. I never do. Rarely do I agree with everything in any article. But, I definitely recommend reading it. So I encourage you to do that. And part of it, you'll enjoy, in quotes, you'll be horrified by the bureaucratic red tape and the sheer arrogance and conceit of bureaucrats in New York preventing scientists from doing their job to actually promote this stuff. Somebody asked, did I watch Bill Maher's viral interview with Dan Crenshaw? Crenshaw was seen as a clear winner in the debate over Trump's response to COVID. No, I haven't seen it, but if Crenshaw was a winner of that debate, then Bill Maher was pathetic, because Trump's response to COVID is atrocious. Atrocious. He gets a clear F on his response to COVID. I'll watch it, but it won't, I can't imagine what Dan Crenshaw could say that would change my mind, because it's not an issue of what Dan Crenshaw says, it's an issue of the facts. And I've gone through the timelines of what the Trump administration did at every point in time, timelines that I don't think are controversial. And if you go through the timelines, it's obvious that this administration is one big failure. And by the way, I had Amesh Adalja here right at the time when Trump did the travel ban on China. And Amesh said they're going to screw this up. They got this all wrong. They don't understand what they're doing. He's not acting based on advice from a scientist. And indeed, very early on in the crisis, the CDC was sidelined. The world's best experts on infectious diseases, on pandemics, and on how to treat and how to deal with and how to manage a population through a pandemic, the best people in the world were sidelined. Why? Because they didn't agree with Trump. Because they didn't agree with Trump. So no, I'll watch Dan Crenshaw's, and maybe I'll even critique it here. I'll put it on video and critique it because, again, so many people will watch it and so many people think it's good. I suspect that it is horrific. And I've never liked Dan Crenshaw. He has this false kind of patriotism about him that I just don't like. These typical conservatives. I can't think of issues where we really substantively, in a meaningful way, agree. All right. I'm going to take a super chat question here. Somebody wants hitchhiking stories. I don't know. It's going to have to be over a glass of wine, so we'll see. Does the morality of suffering lead to a desire to exaggerate negatives like COVID in order to increase the pain? There's a sense in which I think that there's a certain mentality that assumes things are, the world is going to end. Things are awful. Things are bad, and we're incompetent of dealing with them. Altruism is part of that, but I don't think is the essential characteristic. But there's certainly a original sin type mentality that there's some major flaw in us, and we have to pay for it. And COVID has come to make us pay for it. Or global warming has come to make us pay for it. It's we are all going to, we all have to pay for the sin of being alive and actually being productive. But I do think altruism plays a big role in kind of the lockdown mentality. I mean, I've identified this a long time ago at the beginning of this crisis. There's almost no talk by the authorities of isolating the vulnerable, particularly the old. There's almost no talk of separating society into people who are particularly vulnerable, old with pre-existing conditions, and young people who don't have pre-existing conditions. Those two groups, it's clear. One should be isolated, and we should provide the means for which they can be isolated, and the other should not be. And we should separate the two groups in ways that they don't interact. So we should make sure young people don't interact with older people. Now, how you do that exactly, you'd have to work out all the details. But that's where the focus should be. That's where the energy should be focused on. But that people view that as all wrong. No, wait a minute. No. Why should we separate these people out? Why, everybody should suffer. We should treat everybody the same. We should lock down everybody. And those kids going to the beach, what the hell? Why aren't they suffering? Why aren't they sacrificing? Their grandparents are dying and they're at the beach. That's altruism. Now, it could be that it's bad policy to have the kids at the beach and the kids should be more responsible and not at the beach. But it can be that it's an issue of guilting them that way. And if you're worried about grandma and grandpa, find ways to isolate grandpa and grandma from their grandkids. They shouldn't be seeing them. And find ways to test and deal with people who do deal with the elderly, the caregivers. Focus all your attention on helping, on testing the caregivers constantly so that they don't give it to the older people. And work on the hygiene and work on social distancing for old people. So I saw that people were at the beach in Orange County over the weekend in California. Some counties have their beaches open, some don't. I think it's fine that people are at the beach. Now, I'm not sure everybody was behaving in the way they should be in terms of social distancing, because I don't think enough people are taking this seriously. But you can be at the beach and socially distance. After all, it is fresh air. It's not like being stuck at home where you're likely to get COVID from a family member, much more likely to get it in a house environment or through the air conditioning or other aspects of a home life or by touching stuff when you're outside than you are in the fresh air at the beach. Beach is not the place you're probably going to get COVID, right? Particularly if you do some basic social distancing. It turns out sunlight is probably not good for the virus. Humidity is generally not good for the virus. You still could get it. I'm not saying the probability of getting it at the beach is zero. It certainly is not. But it's lower than in a lot of other places. But why does everybody freak out about those evil Californians? Because why are they having fun? So there's definitely an element of altruism in the approach people have taken to this and in the insistence of everybody having to be locked down instead of segregating people. We should be discriminating. We should be segregating. We should be giving different advice to different groups. All right, let's see. I have some questions here. I don't see any super chat questions. I had some questions here that people have submitted. Somebody wants me to discuss the market outlook, short and long term. I mean, it's very difficult to do a market outlook. And the difficulty is, so I'm assuming stock market outlook. And the reason is that stock markets are driven by a number of different parameters, partially by the economy, but also partially by, for example, Federal Reserve policies. When the Federal Reserve prints, I don't know, they're probably going to end this by printing about $6 trillion, on top of all the trillions they printed during the financial crisis. Where does that money go? The money has to go somewhere, and the money has to affect prices in some way. And typically we think of it as affecting inflation. All prices go up. But that's not how it works. It often can affect some prices without affecting other prices. It's a question of where does the money go? And it's quite possible that a lot of this money is going to go into, in a sense, the stock market, into asset prices. And therefore inflate stock prices above their fundamentals, above their connection to the real economy. The same thing with interest rates. Interest rates are being driven to zero. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to have interest rates at zero. Interest rates are way too low for any kind of economic outlook. But they're artificially lowered to those rates, which completely distorts, for example, pricing stocks. The way you should price stocks, the fundamental analysis of pricing stocks, to figure out what a stock is value is to do a discounted present value on the future. You look at cash flows in the future, and you discounted them back based on some rate of return that reflects risk. But stocks are all so low. But interest rates are also low. The lower the interest rate, the lower the discount rate you use, the higher the price is going to be. The higher the price that you get is going to be. So again, completely distorting ability to actually value these companies and actually assess true risk. So interest rates, which are the most important price in the entire economy, are today meaningless because they're constantly being completely manipulated by the government, the Federal Reserve. They are manipulated, not just the short-term rates, which is traditionally manipulated, but long-term rates are manipulated. Now we've got high-yield bonds, which are being bought by the government, which means they're setting, or at least to some extent, setting interest rates. The municipal bonds, every part of the credit market is now being manipulated by the Federal Reserve, which means no interest rates reflected in the prices of those bonds, reflected in the prices of those assets, is meaningless. It is meaningful. They're all centrally planned. I mean, that has massive distortions. So, while I think the economy is going to do very poorly, I don't think, by the way, we're in a Great Depression. I don't think this is going to be, but I do think we're going to come out of this with almost no economic growth. I think we're in a prolonged period of 0 to 1% economic growth. I think that is how we're going to suffer. We're going to suffer with very little opportunities on the upside. Poor people are going to stay poor because there are not going to be opportunities to make money and become middle class. Middle class is going to just barely survive. The wealthy will do okay, particularly if they have their investments in those asset classes that benefit from what the Fed is doing. So it is massively unjust, massively distortive. I think generally stock markets and such will do okay, in spite of the fact that the economy is going to do terrible. Now, in the long run, I don't think stock markets can do okay, because in the long run, stocks have to reflect what the economy has done, and the economy is going to be pathetic. Going to be pathetic. I mean, Charles says he's trying to get his first job. I mean, it is Charles's generation that is really going to take this in the face. They're the ones who are going to suffer the most from this because they don't have savings, trying to get their first job. I mean, I would just say, I don't know what you do. I can't give you a tip on how to get a first job. I would just say, get a job and do really, really well in it and save. Even though I typically don't advise young people save. I'm not big into saving in your 20s. I think in this environment you should, because you don't know if your job will be there, and you don't know if there are going to be other jobs. I think we're heading towards a period of very, very difficult economy for a long, long time, with a lot of ups and downs. And ultimately, if we don't change course, we're heading towards an economic apocalypse where we will lose our wealth, where we will become significantly poorer. But we're still not there. I don't think this is it yet. It keeps building. This step is suck the growth out of the economy. It's going to suck the growth out of the economy. All right. Gail says, did you see the critical break in the food chain? Yeah, I mean, this is real challenging. If some of these food companies cannot, if the supply chain for food companies, if that's going to break and we're not going to be able to get food, I mean, that could be really bad. Now, I think it's overstated right now. One of the things that a lot of economists don't take into account, and certainly journalists don't take into account, and people who write stories about these things don't take into account, is human ingenuity. And when things break, people figure out how to fix them. When things break, when a supply chain breaks, new supply chains get created. So it's, I don't think things are going to be as bad as some of these articles project them to be. Notice that supply chains in the United States are breaking, which is interesting because everybody's saying we shouldn't trade with the world because what happens if we get into a crisis and the supply chains break? Well, if you get into a crisis, the supply chains can break anyway. And maybe our supply chain to Mexico is actually better than our supply chain to food in the Midwest. And if our farmers in the Midwest are going to get crushed by something, isn't it good that we're also buying food from Mexico? So no, you want a diverse sources. You want global trade. You want globalization because you want to be able to source supply from multiple places so if one supply chain breaks, you've got alternatives to it. Bree says, I think this is an opportunity to finally blame the economic catastrophes in government. The free market, after all, is on lockdown. I think that's right. I don't think it'll work, but I think that's right. I mean, this lockdown has proved that people seem to be now conditioned to look for government for solutions, to accept whatever government tells them, to say yes, sir, and jump to that conclusion. Right. Alex asks, usually PE and VC investments are cyclical and reflect recessions. Do you expect the VC investments in startups will stagnate after the crisis? I think it'll slow because, startups, success of startups very much depends on the direction of the economy, how it's doing, which sectors are strong, which sectors are weak. And I think that as long as there's uncertainty about economic growth and about the sectors, VCs will be hesitant to pull the trigger. And also, a lot of the companies that they're already invested in are going to be struggling to find new sources of capital, one assumes. And the VCs will have to be supporting their existing investments more than they typically do. But we'll see. I mean, again, VC and PE funds are incredibly flexible. They adapt very quickly and very well. And this is part of why I think we always, and the same thing happened in 08, 09, particularly libertarians do this, they underestimate the flexibility, innovation, and productive genius that is still alive and well in the United States. Right? Somebody asks, are you a VC or am I a venture capitalist? No. I tried. I dabbled for a while in funding companies directly. I was not good at it particularly. It's not what I'm good at. I then, for a while, was an investor who invested with VCs. So my job was to select the best VCs. And I think I was pretty good at that. Our firm was pretty good at that, selecting which VCs were good and which were not. We had a few home runs. We had a few really good investments that did really well. But it's not my strength. I'm not good at that. I don't have the kind of mind. It's not trained to think in those terms. I don't understand the companies that did well. I never understood Amazon. Now I understand it, but I never understood it early on. I would have never given eBay money. And eBay is one of the most successful investments ever for Benchmark. That's a VC. There are a lot of companies that made it huge, and I wouldn't have gotten them. And if you look at the success rate at a firm like Sequoia Capital, it's unbelievable how good they are at this. So to be good at this is a unique skill. All right, tips for a finance student for success in industry. Definitely study Austrian economics. So don't just accept what you study in finance in terms of economics. A lot of it is wrong. And then I'd say, be skeptical about, learn the math, know the math, do the equations, be able to do all that, be skeptical about it, learn probabilities and statistics. Really, really important to be good in math is to learn the probability and statistics. And then I'd say go out and get a good job. And get a good job and learn on the you'll learn more in a job than you will at school. But, and be skeptical again of the math they teach you. If you've got a good teacher, they'll tell you that a lot of the equations they give you are not really, don't really work, but they don't always do that. Assuming we meaningfully protect the vulnerable, can we significantly reopen without massive testing, contract tracing, and isolating? Yes, I think you can. I think you have to. It would be ideal if you also did massive testing. I mean, Sweden is not doing massive testing, unfortunately. I think they'd be doing much better off if they did. They're not doing the contact tracing and isolating, not as much as they should. They've isolated the vulnerable to the extent that they can, and they're doing okay. And I think that if you tell people they should self-isolate, if you tell people and companies that people should work from home if they can, and to the extent that they can, and if you tell people not to crowd into restaurants and bars, or even just tell restaurants and bars you can only take in 25% or 50% of your normal capacity, that's better than completely locked down. Then I think people adapt and people adjust, and you can have a life. It's not going to be exactly the same life as we had before, but it'll be a life, and you can get rid of the lockdowns. So we'll see in Georgia the testing this. I think it's going to go fine. Look, the death rate's going to go up. But as I said before, people will die. People will die. Right. Let's see. What do you like? Let me see if there's another. Okay. What do you like and what do you dislike about the character Bobby Axelrod from the show Billions? So I like the show Billions. I have to say I primarily like the show Billions because of the way it portrays the district attorney of New York. It portrays him as a real scumbag. And appropriately so, given that position was held by Rudolph Giuliani for many years when he was the scumbag of New York City. And then it's a position slightly different. The district attorney of the state of New York was then Spitzer, another real evil guy. So those two guys are the models, in my mind, for the character in Billions. And I love that they have the balls to portray him as such. Stefan, I'll get you a question. I didn't miss it. I think, let's see, Stefan. Yes, I've got it. Going to get to it. Sorry, I skipped ahead, but I'll answer it next. So I primarily love how they represent him as power-lusting, focused all about power. He wants to be the governor, and he'll do anything. And that's Spitzer and Giuliani to the T. Power-lusting, creepy, ugly human beings. What do I like about Bobby Axelrod? What I like about him is his confidence, his mastery of his universe, his just bigger-than-life character. He doesn't indulge in whims, so he's generally rational. I mean, with one exception, I'll get to that, and that's what I don't like about him. He doesn't do drugs. He's not a womanizer, as you'd expect one of these billionaires to be. He is a hard-working, thinking person who is super confident about life and about his ability to live it well. And I love that. The thing I don't like about him is, and this is true of a lot of, I guess, some rich people, but is that he's measuring himself against other people constantly. He views the world as, in some sense, a zero-sum game. He views it as a battle, as a war, where he wins, others lose, rather than as a win-win trader principle world. So he is guided by emotion in trying to crush others. And in measuring himself relative to others rather than in measuring himself versus himself. So there's an aspect of second-handedness there. And at the same time, of also first-handedness. So the second-handedness kind of only appears in certain parts of his life, but important parts. So I wish he was more consistently a trader. And of course, the other thing I don't like about the show is that they portray hedge funds as inherently dependent on what you'd call inside information. That unless they're manipulating, unless they're cheating, unless they can't make the money, and that's just not true. Although there is a scene where one of his employees wants to burn down, I think, a whole chicken thing in order to make the stock plummet, I can't remember the exact specifics. And Bobby Axel goes out there and stops him from doing it because he knows that's wrong. But I love the bigger than life, and the embracing life and the willing to live. What are my thoughts on the movie Gone with the Wind and its main character's pursuit of values? And did Ayn Rand ever write about the movie? She did. She wrote particularly about the book. She liked the book. Not because it reflected her kind of heroes, because it didn't. But, it reflects, for example, think about the last line in the movie. I'll think about it tomorrow. Where that suggests she'll never think about it. And that's evasion. And she's an evader. Right? And the movie portrays that really, really well, the consequences of evasion, and that's good. So I think the movie is a good movie. I have a problem with movies that portray life in the South in such gallant, romanticized way. I think that's horrible to portray it that way. So I find movies about that period problematic. But I think there's a lot of good stuff in Gone with the Wind. There's a lot of interesting characters. There's a lot of people getting what they deserve, mostly negative, but people getting justice, a sense of justice. Certainly the lead character, what is Scarlett? She gets what she deserves. She's compromised. She pursues second-handed values. She pursues the wrong things, and she suffers, and she's an evader, and she suffers the consequences. She evades true love for appearances. Now, I don't remember the movie that well, so I haven't seen it in a while, but that's my sense. So it's very well made, it's enjoyable, and it's interesting. But it's got real problems in it, particularly in terms of how it portrays the South. Okay, 2 last questions. Comment on Planet of the Humans. I can't because I haven't seen it. Let me wait on that. When I see it, or when I read more about it, I have more information about it, I'll comment on it. Ideally, if I see it, I can actually do a review of it. How can Trump not feel embarrassed to brag about his TV ratings for the Corona briefing? Because he doesn't know what embarrassed means. He's a narcissist. All he cares about is how people view him, how people see him. And he thinks this is all one big, reality TV show. And he's got good ratings. So he's doing a great job because people are watching him. And that's what matters in life, whether people watch him or not. That's truly what he thinks, or psychologically what he feels. That's my estimate. I can't get inside his head. But yeah, it should be embarrassing. Anybody should be embarrassed by that. I'm embarrassed for him, but he can't feel embarrassed about that. To him, that is the measure of success. Not whether you've killed the virus, not whether you protected America and Americans, but whether you get good ratings. All right. Thanks, everybody. Please, when the video comes out of just the segment about the doctor, please share that. Please get it out, particularly to friends of yours. Wow, the questions are suddenly flowing in. Can you comment on the Laffer curve and why economists don't support it, that it increases government revenues? Because it's not about government revenues. Taxes are not about government revenues. Taxes are about inequality. Taxes are about bilking the rich. Taxes are about penalizing people. They have nothing to do with raising revenue. If they did, everybody would pay attention to the Laffer curve because it's true. I don't like it, but it's true. That is, there is an optimal rate, which is lower than typical, that where you maximize revenue for the government. That is, when you start raising rates above that rate, actual revenue to the government goes down because people are less motivated to work, people are more motivated to shield income from taxes and so on. But there is an optimal way to maximize revenue, and that's just science, that's just truth. But I hate that because I don't want to argue for a maximum revenue. I want to minimize revenue to the government. I want to minimize revenue to the government, not maximize it. Oh my God, Frank. Can you elaborate on why Dominique drops the statue in the fountainhead? Yes. Dominique's view is that the statue is such a great value. It's so beautiful. It is so moving. It is so significant a human achievement that the world is not worthy of it. That while she is probably worthy of it, she can't stand that anybody else can see it. She can't stand that it exists in a world with Ellsworth Toohey. She can't stand the fact that both these things, and because Dominique is focused on the negative, she destroys it, right? Instead of just keeping it for herself, which is what she would do if she was focused on the positive. And that's what Rourke teaches her, is that all those things, the Tooheys, all that crap in society, doesn't matter. It can only go so deep, and you have to live your life following your values, in pursuit of your values, for yourself, for your happiness. I do recommend essays on the Fountainhead, edited by Robert Mayhew. There's some brilliant essays there about the different characters in the Fountainhead. If you're interested, you will learn a lot from those essays. All right, you can find them on Amazon. Thanks, everybody. I will be back on, I don't know when, maybe tomorrow. Wednesday, I'm going to be interviewing Andrew Bernstein, I think Wednesday, on his new book on heroism. We'll be talking about that. All right, thanks, everybody. Talk to you later. Don't forget to share, like, and support the show by going to yaronbrookshow.com/support. Bye, everybody.